We need to bridge the gap, get our act together, preserve Palestine, because it is our real symbol of unity and the success of any future endeavor. If we forget Palestine, I know the suffering in Syria, I know suffering in Iraq, I know the suffering in Yemen, I know suffering everywhere. Okay. You see, you distract me there, I have to restart. We know all of these problems, but we have to find a way of uniting together. It is not enough to be an opposition force to this ruler or that ruler. We have to have a civilizational project and a political project and an ideological project that transcends the current projects that we work on and have been working on and we were brought up on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Mousalli. So, very really fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. So, as I understand, we have no religious-based, division in the Middle East, in the Muslim countries, but we have so many different fault lines based upon ethnicity, political agendas, etc., etc. Okay, thank you so much. And now the floor is to give to Professor Dr. Nader Hashemi. As I announced at the beginning, the title of his presentation is Authoritarian Roots of Sectarianism in the Middle East Today. Please.
So I had a PowerPoint presentation that I'm told is about to be on the screen in a moment. And so while it's coming up, let me begin by thanking Sami Al-Aryan and his team for putting this conference together, for inviting me back, but most importantly, perhaps, for taking me outside of Donald Trump's America for only a few days. It has been wonderful to be here. This conference is called the Second International Conference on the Muslim Ummah, Fault Lines and Perils Facing Muslim Societies. And the obvious reality stares us in the face. Our Muslim Ummah is in deep crisis. It's not an exaggeration to say that these are the dark days of Muslim history. The age of surrender, humiliation, capitulation, collaboration, punctuated by madness. On the periphery of the Islamic world, in Tunisia and Malaysia, there are some signs of hope, but everywhere in between there is a vast sea of darkness, from Palestine, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Kashmir, Myanmar, and in China, where according to a recent UN report, there are 1 million Muslim Uyghurs held in a concentration camp. The rise of sectarianism as a major theme in the politics of this region highlights and reminds us that these are the dark days of Muslim history. Never before have we seen this type of bloodletting, this type of conflict, this type of animosity in terms of its depth, its breadth, and its spread between Sunni and Shia populations as we've seen today in recent years. This is the topic that I want to theorize and historicize by way of my presentation. Last year I published a book on this topic. And what I want to do is talk about the key thesis of the book, but then focus on what Sami asked me to speak about, the geopolitics of sectarianism, focusing on the regional and the international dimensions of sectarianism that is fueled by these types of politics. And so when the book was conceived, we really had an American audience in mind, and the American audience has a view of sectarianism that Muslims have always been killing each other. It goes back to the 7th century, and this is an enduring and ongoing feature of Muslim societies. What we try to do in the book is push back against that argument. But since we're here in the Muslim world, it has to be stated that sadly, unfortunately today, there is a growing number of Muslims who also share this view about deep historic animosities between Sunni and Shia. They believe this, albeit for different reasons than Americans do. This is the problem, I think, of reading history backwards rather than forward. It's understandable to look over the last 2 decades, where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in wars in Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, and to a lesser extent Lebanon, and believe that this is fundamentally an antagonism between different sects of Islam that have deep historical roots. Some Sunni Muslims today believe that Shiism has always been, from its inception, a threat. This is a heretical movement. From its inception, it sought to divide Muslims, corrupt the core message of Islam, lead believers astray, create disunity among the community of Muslims, sometimes in alliance with outside enemies. Similarly, some Shia believe that Sunni Islam is fundamentally oppressive, intolerant, prone to Wahhabism, and that the decline of Islamic civilization can be blamed on the fact that Sunnis have always been in control, and that's why we're in this mess. Now, increasing numbers of Muslims and Westerners have fallen into this trap of believing that sectarian conflict, the nature of it, has deep historical roots. In the West, where I'm currently living, President Obama was one of the biggest proponents of this thesis. He repeatedly used the phrase ancient sectarian differences to explain what's happening in the Middle East today, which he claimed was, quote, rooted in conflicts that date back millennia. And just before he left office, he used the term, or he said explicitly that the only organizing principles in the Middle East today are sectarian. And what's interesting about this claim is that there are very drastic and negative foreign policy consequences that flow from this argument. Because if, allegedly, sectarianism is so deeply rooted in the Middle East, then you can never have democracy. You can never have political order. You can never have human rights. And this is the argument that you hear today, that the only policy response is we have to support authoritarian dictators, because at least they will keep these backward savages in control. And so the problem of this sectarian, ancient sectarian thesis argument is that it produces arguments within corridors of power in the West that support authoritarian dictatorship and oppose any support for democracy or political transformation. Just to cite one person who you may have heard of, his name is Thomas Friedman. He writes for the New York Times, and recently talking about sectarian tensions in the Middle East, he said that sectarian tensions in the Middle East had long been managed by iron fists from above. But after the Arab Spring, when the stranglehold of dictators was weakened, we noticed a horrifying war of all against all has exploded, sort of wishing that we could go back to the good old days of authoritarian stranglehold. So this raises the question, how can we understand properly the nature of sectarianism in the Middle East today? If we're going to reject the ancient sectarian thesis argument, what's the proper framing? And I think the proper framing is to ask the question, why now? Why at this particular moment in the Middle East have we seen an upsurge in sectarian conflict and not at times before? How can we explain it? This is the core thesis of the book that we advance, we call it the sectarianization thesis. As an alternative framing and theoretical approach to the question of sectarian conflict in the Middle East today, we propose the term sectarianization and its verb cognate to sectarianize, which we define as an active process shaped by political actors operating within specific contexts, pursuing political goals that involve the mobilization of popular sentiments around particular identity markers. Class dynamics, fragile states, and geopolitical rivalries also shape the sectarianization process. The usual term sectarianism is devoid of such reference points. It tends to imply a static, given, a trans-historical, enduring, and ongoing characteristic of Arab and Islamic societies that have allegedly shaped these societies from the 7th century until today. The theme of political authoritarianism is central to the sectarianization thesis. This form of political rule, as you know, has long dominated the politics of the Middle East, and its corrosive legacy has deeply corrupted the politics and societies of this region. Authoritarianism, and not theology, is the critical factor in the sectarianization process. Authoritarian regimes in the Middle East have deliberately and purposefully manipulated sectarian identities in various ways as a strategy of deflecting demands for political change and perpetuating their hold on power. This anti-democratic political context is essential for understanding sectarian conflict in Muslim societies today, especially in those societies that contain a mix of Sunni and Shia populations. To paraphrase from the famous aphorism from the Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz about war being the continuation of politics by other means, in our reading, sectarian conflict in the Middle East today is primarily about the continuation of political rule via identity mobilization. So the theoretical summary of the book tries to reject this thesis of ancient sectarian differences between Sunni and Shia, which I think fails to explain what's happening today in the region. This view of an alleged chasm that goes back to the 7th century clouds rather than illuminates the complex realities of the politics of this region, which are better understood as a series of developmental and economic crises, both political and economic, that the region has been facing since World War II. The policies of leading Western democracies toward the Middle East, especially the United States, have exacerbated these political and economic problems. So while it's true that religious identities are more salient in the politics of the Middle East today than they were before, it's also true that these political identities and these sectarian identities have been deliberately politicized and then lethalized by state actors who are pursuing political gain. The politics of authoritarian regimes is the key context for understanding this problem. There is a symbiotic relationship between pressure from below, demanding change, demanding representation, demanding inclusion, versus refusal by ruling elites from above to share or relinquish power. This produces a crisis of legitimacy that needs to be carefully managed, and the politics of sectarianism, or as we frame it, sectarianization, the deliberate manipulation of religious identities, is a result of this political dynamic. Notwithstanding the rhetoric that we hear from some Sunni monarchies in the Middle East or presidents for life in the various Arab republics, ruling elites are not truly embedded to a particular sectarian identity. The driver of politics is not a defense of a theological position or loyalty to the collective interest of a religious sect. The core allegiance of ruling elites is to their political thrones and their various clients, whether Shia or Sunni, who can help sustain them in power. What really is important here is not religious piety, but political power. As one of the contributors to our book writes, sectarianism is not an inherent quality of the people of the Middle East. There are sectarian entrepreneurs and state-sanctioned religious scholars who continue to flourish in the present by deliberately manipulating these identities in the interest of the ruling regimes that rule over them, and often at their request. Sectarianism, in other words, is a modern political phenomenon that is nourished by authoritarian regimes whose rule depends on invoking these religious identities and often make these identities lethally politicized at particular moments of crisis. In short, sectarianism does not explain the current turmoil in the Middle East today. Political authoritarianism does. That's the core argument of the book. Now, how does regional and international politics feed and fuel the process of sectarian conflict? Let me begin with this photo that some of you might remember. In 2006, according to a widely respected poll within the Sunni Arab world, these two political figures were deemed to be the most respected and admired political figures in the Sunni Arab world. Two Shia politicians, one of them not even an Arab. That was roughly 12 years ago. How did that change so quickly and so rapidly? I think that poll tells you that people have other identities, particularly within the Sunni Arab world, that are not shaped by their particular religious sect. Well, one thing that changed from 2006 is, of course, the Arab Spring and the conflict in Syria, where Iran and Hezbollah decided to back a brutal dictator, thus completely changing and inflaming the question of sectarian dynamics within the Middle East. Now, sectarianism in the Middle East does have a history, and it's not the ancient history that we sometimes hear about that goes back to the 7th century. The history of sectarian conflict really begins in 1979, and it has key moments where it undergoes particular transformations. 1979 is the key date. I'll talk about that in a moment. 2003 is a key date, and 2011 is a key date. Now, of course, the key driver of sectarian conflict regionally is the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Both authoritarian states, both representing the interest of the ruling regimes, both fueling conflict in different ways. I don't have time to talk about explicitly how Iran and Saudi Arabia use sectarianism to advance their states' interests. They do it in different ways. I think, broadly speaking, over the course of time, the Saudi form of sectarianism on a global level is much more toxic and much more pernicious, but Iran has been playing this ugly game as well since 2011. If you ask me about this in the question and answer period, I'd be happy to elaborate. But this is one of the key drivers, this regional dynamic. I don't think we can start to think about a reduction of sectarianism in the Middle East unless Iran and Saudi Arabia somehow agree to reduce their hostilities between each other. A bit of history. Prior to 1979, Saudi Arabia and Iran had actually very close and amicable relations. The heads of state of these countries got along perfectly well. The idea of ancient animosities rooted within their sects simply does not hold power if you know the history of the modern Middle East. There's a civil war in Yemen today, but people forget there was another civil war in the 1960s. It was a civil war where Iran and Saudi Arabia were on the same side of that conflict, backing and supporting the existence of a monarchy, fighting different forms of regional forces. Back then, the civil war in Lebanon was not sectarian. It was based on regime type. It was based on ideology and Cold War alliances. It was based on pro-Western monarchies on one side, opposing revolutionary socialist and nationalist forces on the other. 1979 changes everything. The revolution in Iran emerges, and of course it sends a shockwave to other authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, who then begin to deploy a sectarian anti-Shia argument as a way of trying to diminish the popularity of revolutionary political Islam coming out of Iran that was at the time, and even still today, at least on the official level, was decidedly anti-sectarian. You know, the leaders of Iran repeatedly claim, at least at the level of theory, that they are motivated by Muslim Shia, Sunni Shia sort of unity. They have no particular official sectarian agenda, although the actual way it plays out is very different. The Iran-Iraq War was an important early phase in sectarian conflict in the Middle East. It was a major force. It got much worse as we move forward. The Afghan War is where you begin to see the cultivation of a radical sort of Sunni sort of movement. Back then it was supported by the West because the West was benefiting from that particular constellation of forces of radical Islam, of a Sunni sort of radical Islam. But then from this movement, you begin to see these offshoot movements, these radical sort of breakaway Salafi jihadi movements that take on a particular anti-Shia animus. And Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the sort of al-Qaeda representative in Iraq, is one of the first articulators of this decidedly venomous Shia narrative, effectively dehumanizing Shia Muslims on a grand scale. He finds his home in 2003 after the American invasion of Iraq, when the regional politics and the regional map starts to change very differently. And then you begin to see Sunni heads of state talking about the fear of a Shia crescent taking over the region, which has some validity in it, but I think it was grossly exaggerated. The real fear here is different forms of politicized Islam challenging entrenched monarchies in the region. But of course, using that fear in the language of sectarian language. This becomes the dominant discourses of monarchies and heads of state within the Sunni Muslim world. Now, of course, MBS, who very much is in the news today, takes this to a new level. When he was in the United States earlier this year, he said on several occasions that Iran is much worse than Hitler Hitler's Germany, because Hitler just wanted to take over Europe. But according to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Iran is a much bigger threat because it aspires to take over the entire world. So there could be no negotiations with a Hitler. They have to be defeated, upping the rhetoric here and increasing Sunni Shia tensions. But then Iran also plays this nasty game itself. This is a hardline member of Iran's parliament, very close to the supreme leader, who confirms the worst suspicions and the worst arguments that you hear within the Sunni Muslim world, bragging that Iran controls 3 capitals within the Muslim world today, inflaming sectarianism in very negative ways. 2011 is the next turning point. The authoritarian architecture in this region was deeply shaken, and the strategy that many authoritarian regimes employ to deflect the Arab Spring, particularly in those countries that have a mix of Sunni Shia population, is to play the sectarian card. Bashar al-Assad did it, the Bahrainis did it, other countries did it as well. And there's a heavy and severe crackdown that employs sectarian narratives that deliberately try to stoke and stroke sectarian conflict as a way of protecting and preventing demands for political change. Madawi al-Rashid is one of the contributors to our book. She has a fascinating chapter specifically how Saudi Arabia responds to the Arab Spring, both by deploying forces in Bahrain, but also trying to explain the uprising in its Shia provinces using the language of sectarianism. And then you have the counter-revolution. You have these deeply entrenched states employed and using language that often is sectarian as a way of holding on to power. Generals, gangsters, and jihadists are very much part of the attempt to undermine the power of the Arab Spring revolutions. Now, Iran, also is guilty of this, particularly its policies in Syria. Iran has employed a particular strategy of sectarianism that is responsible for arguably the biggest bloodletting in this region in the last several decades. I don't have time to talk about how Iran has done this, but it's very pernicious, it's very toxic, and it's raised the temperature of Sunni-Shia conflict in this region to new heights that can't be ignored. And then finally, there's Donald Trump. Let me sort of end with Donald Trump. Donald Trump, internationally, coming to power, embraces Saudi Arabia, embraces the United Arab Emirates, embraces the monarchy in Bahrain, and basically incorporates that particular worldview as being central to U.S. foreign policy. Recall the first trip that Donald Trump took as head of state was to Saudi Arabia, where they rolled out the red carpet, and he basically embraced the entire Saudi worldview. The only good thing that we can say about this right now is after the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, this is blown up in their face. They don't know what to do. They were hoping that MBS would lead them to the promised land. It's pretty clear that he's leading them in a different direction. And so now this strategy of sort of centering your policy on a Saudi sectarian narrative to change the regional politics of the Middle East is not working out in the way that many people hoped. A last comment, how Israel factors into this particular story. Israel has adopted the language of Saudi sectarian politics to advance its regional agenda against Iran and against Hamas. This summer, the Israeli Defense Forces issued a fatwa. In 2 videos released by the Israeli Defense Forces, they sought to denigrate and dehumanize Shia Muslims and then connect Shia Islam to Hamas by quoting Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and Ibn Taymiyyah, referring to these people as enlightened Salafis and attacking Hamas for its close links with Iran. Citing a prayer from the Prophet Muhammad, the major general from the Israeli Defense Force painted Hamas as an Iranian stooge and asserted that, quote, "Whoever acts like a people is one of them. You, Hamas, have officially become Shia, in line with the Prophet's saying," and he sought to rally other Sunni political forces against Hamas by claiming that it has become effectively a Shia political force. So Israel now, buying into and deeply aligned with these other regional forces in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, with strong backing from Washington, D.C., is flaming the sectarian conflict in the Middle East for its own regional agenda. Now, I don't have time to talk about this because my time is up, but I think one of the challenges of those of us who care about the Ummah, who care about a better Islamic world, is to start to think about how we can de-sectarianize the Middle East. The last chapter of our book actually goes into a historical and comparative study of lessons that could be learned in terms of how we can start to try and roll back and desectarianize the Middle East. I don't have time to talk about it, but if you ask me in the question and answer session, I'd be happy to elaborate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Nader Hashemi. Yeah, it's very important that remark that the sectarianism we see in the Islamic world indeed is not originated from what we had in the history, but it is quite a new phenomena which is, related to the modernity somehow and the authoritarian states in the Islamic world, and also, somehow related with the Western, policy in the Middle East and in the Islamic world also. Thank you so much. So I would like to give floor to Professor Dr. Mehmet Ali Buyukkara, and his topic is related to the introducing a theoretical paradigm for interdenominational harmony and peace.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank to the organizers of this conference for their effort to gather from many parts of the world, together esteemed scholars from many parts of the world in order to talk and discuss important issues regarding to Muslim Ummah. The Muslim Ummah is really tired of several conflicts caused by denominations and several religious movements, mazahib, al-faraq, and other things. These are leading factors that disrupt social peace and stability. In order to prevent this threat, different theories and projects have so far been developed. In the short time given to me, I try to compare two main theoretical and practical approaches. These are modern and postmodern approaches. I also try to set forth what sort of way can be consistent and more serviceable to provide sectarian peace and reconciliation in the current situation of the Islamic world. Firstly, the modern paradigm. As is known, denominations are the institutionalized forms of interpretative differences related to the Quranic revelation and the prophetic tradition. Because of this nature, they are fully human formations. Modern religious discourse tries to reveal the groundlessness and futility of this division. By doing this, the modernism applies directly to the first authentic Islamic sources, namely the Quran and the Sunnah, by overlooking the denominational traditions. Through the return to a kind of supra-denominational idea, differences could be easily minimized and sectarian peace could be safely provided. In this approach, defining, designing, uniforming, and centralist characteristics of the modernism evidently manifest itself. The modern paradigm has been usually used within two different religio-political discourses. The first discourse is Islamism or pan-Islamism. The discourse of the Muslim Union is the source of a language that has been widely used by the Islamic scholars, thinkers, and politicians since the 19th century. We see the strong traces of these accents in the works of famous Islamist personalities such as Jamaluddin Afghani, Mehmet Akif, and Muhammad Iqbal. The verse, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ, the believers are but brothers, is significant in this context. Several resistance organizations in the lands of imperialist occupation or Islamist Dawah movements in seemingly independent Muslim countries have used these kinds of arguments successfully in order to weaken the divisive sectarian and ethnical factors hindering Muslim unity. Second discourse that uses modern paradigm as a tool is nationalism. We also see that the nationalist movements tended to prefer the same supradenominational discourse. It has often been applied to break the sectarianism that has wreaked havoc on the idea of the nation when the modern nation states began to be established in the 19th century. They arose a multi-phase and multi-denominational geography of the Middle East. The politicians and ideologists pursuing the creation of Turkish, Arab, and Iranian nation states always defended the idea of a supradenominational Islam. For example, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, Diyanet in Turkey, was designed as an upper institution above all denominations. In this sense, there is a remarkable difference between nationalist and pan-Islamist discourses. Contrary to the pan-Islamism, the nationalism always expressed itself with a secular rhetoric. This assessment has some reflections. For example, denominations and religious groups have destroyed the original understanding of religion. Thus, the broad coverage space of the Quran-originated Islam has been narrowed within the scope of denominational creeds and rulings. Thanks to their secularist policy, this denominational mentality has been disabled, so the religion has been liberated. The problems. The modern rhetoric, even if well-intentioned, is far from being a unifying function, contrary to what might be thought, because the criticism often goes beyond the scope of sectarianism to the level of the criticism of denominations and religious groups. This is quite uncomfortable and often dishonorable for the members of these formations. The factor of nation sometimes, because of the nationalist reflexes, becomes a criteria for the meritorious or worthless nature of a denomination. For example, it is often said that Sunnis, Shiis, or Alevis living in one country is more reasonable, more likable, more agreeable, etc., compared to the followers of the same denominations living in another country. They are allegedly unlike the others because they grow in the same country, drink the same water, breathe the same air, and share the same history. From this point, the nation-state tries to reach a consciousness of a nation that exceeds religions and denominations. However, denominations have an identity that crosses the borders. They are more rooted in history than the modern nation identity. The supra-denominational approach of the modern paradigm advocates that the problems Muslims are now facing must be solved on the axis of revelation and reason, wahi wa aql. In this sense, it is not desirable to confront the dogmatic aspect of the Islam, which is in fact the natural consequence of being a religion. The claim that no irrational thing can be found when Islam is concerned is very controversial. Such a judgment may serve as a theoretical basis for stretching religious dogmas. Hence, traditional rooted sects has always looked at this approach skeptically and generally not accredited. This method was a kind of extravagance. The scholars and thinkers who wish to relieve the Ummah by eradicating sectarian fanaticism have neither gained the confidence of traditional religious circles nor properly explained to public their intentions. So the reform has always been limited to small efforts. The appeal of the modern paradigm for meeting around the top Islamic principle of Tawheed, despite all its fascination, is not alone enough in terms of sectarian reconciliation and peace. This thesis that the belief in Tawheed, in Nubuwwah, in Akhirah, as the three main Islamic principles constitutes the common ground of the different denominations, doesn't seem to be adequate to attain the aim, because it is well known by its specialists that, especially in syncretic featured denominations, belief in monotheism, prophethood, and afterlife is quite integrated with ambiguous and blurred speculations. This is why such formations uncompromisingly differ from each other and from mainstreams. Moreover, the appeal for the common ground gives to the mainstream trends the right to identify or to describe the beliefs of minority groups differently from their own definitions. Secondly, the postmodern paradigm as an alternative. The postmodernism encourages community feelings. All denominational sectarian formations are accepted as reality, regardless their righteousness or fallaciousness. Since every religious group creates its own truth, creed, and lifestyle, postmodernists accept denomination and group conflict as a natural reality. According to the postmodern paradigm, the common general concepts connecting all people have no longer been functional. What is prevalent must be typical definitions and descriptions made by each of personal or group identity. Nobody else should be allowed to attribute value or to set norms or forms for others. The postmodern paradigm has always been distrustful of the rational, normative, holistic, and centralist character of the modernism. Therefore, the postmodern paradigm is not as frightening as the modern paradigm in terms of denominations and religious groups. The postmodernism distinguishes itself with cultural autonomy, downsizing of the state, emphasis on rights more than law, applications to multiple religious education, and common customary law options. These lead to open an area protecting the identities, institutions, and achievements of major religious formations like Sunnism or Shiism. On the other hand, this approach provides important assurance of the sustainability of these smaller sectarian structures in the face of so-called major denominations. It also provides a shield against oppression and discrimination. In addition, civil society as an indispensable instrument of postmodernism opens up the possibilities with which denominations freely represent themselves to the public, so their demands can be easily carried to all social spheres, including politics. Everyone is right in his own way, as the famous motto of postmodernist relativism is the philosophical foundation of multi-religious education. The call of the modernism to become united turns necessarily by this relativism into a call to come together. The dialogue opportunities become more efficient around this call. What are the problems relating postmodernism? Despite all these advantages, the postmodern paradigm and its politics constitute a source of problems for denominations and religious groups. The traditional ties of believers with the past, which the modern approach arrogantly ignores, was met with respect in the postmodern approach. However, the same approach, while respecting the past and the tradition on one hand, leads to the destruction of denominational discipline and hierarchy, on the other hand, by rejecting the conception of authority. In other words, the postmodern approach will normally respect the past and the tradition, opens the door to heterodoxies and protest movements, and therefore betrays the past and the tradition. For the postmodernism, it doesn't seem possible to accept the definite and unchanging elements of religions and denominations. This relativity brought about the ambiguous and slippery ground, which is very disturbing in terms of traditional mainstream structures. The composition of values, directionlessness, irregularity, dissociation, and degeneration are really damaging. As a conclusion, we must first emphasize that the issues we have assessed here have significant indicators that the modern enlightened universalist paradigm seems to be no longer functional. All the efforts of constructing an official and supra-denominational religion purified from traditional elements have come to nothing. To tell the truth, the presentation of the modernist paradigm with an Islamist rhetoric, especially in the 19th century, has contributed to the formation of United Ummah conception. In this way, mutual hatred and prejudices are also reduced to a certain level. However, in spite of these advantages, we cannot talk about a satisfactory success. Ultimately, the Islamist revolutionaries of Iran have unfortunately failed to go beyond forming a sectarian state. This is a complete frustration for the 20th century Islamism. The Islamism, on the other hand, has failed to prevent Salafi sectarianism. Moreover, it has somewhat been trapped in the narrow, chaotic vortex of the exclusivist Salafism. It generated very small fractions from within, especially in the 1990s, which produced sectarian violence. It has left far behind in achieving the unifying pan-Islamist goals and has not achieved its ideals. The nationalist presentation of the modern paradigm, on the other hand, has been rather functioning as an instrument of secularist nation-states. It has restricted religious freedoms in the name of so-called authentic Islam, so that the denominational religious communities are offended and the pious citizens are moved away from their states. It has also distorted the internal dynamics of the denominations by creating artificial national sectarian structures. Calling for the synthetic conception of the Quran and the reason-centered religion, it has attempted to make the traditionalist sections of the society an instrument of engineering in religion. On the other hand, the postmodern paradigm with its features such as avoiding to determine norms, restricting the field of practical reason, emphasizing rights instead of law, cultural autonomy, multi-religious education, and opening doors to customary law practices, has generally been found to be safer and caring in terms of religious groups, including denominations. The Ottoman millet system, often presented as a good example for denominational pluralism. It was an advanced system under its own historical conditions that kept together different religious formations and denominations in peace for centuries. However, the millet system doesn't have enough equipment for today's world in terms of social contract and equal citizenship. Lebanese confessional system is often said to be an imitation of the millet system, but it is now entirely a deadlocked system. Another interesting example is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Despite its partly constitutional pluralism, it is unfortunately acting as a repressive nation state, somewhat carrying the typical modern and secular character of the other Middle Eastern states. Need only 2 minutes, only 2 minutes. Regardless of whether they are majority or minority, religious belief groups such as sects and tariqas should be officially recognized, and the freedom of religion and conscience should be guaranteed. This only takes place in the forms of government in which the constitution is composed entirely on a social contract based on natural rights and equal citizenship. As a form of government, deliberative democracy might be evaluated and worked on in terms of the subject we deal, despite all difficulties in implementation. Because this kind of democracy practice prefers a citizenship that combines communities belonging to different beliefs. In other words, it makes people easier to become full citizens without giving up their identities, also being away from similarizing policies. Besides the constitutional recognition and the freedom of religion, including the rights of worship, organization, education, expression, and broadcasting, some other things to be done are also necessary. It is equally important in terms of denominations and religious communities to provide social justice and equality, to improve the conditions of human living, to strengthen democratic devices and civil society, by this way to achieve free political participation and to ensure general security. Education and school curricula may need to be refined in order to remove prejudices and mutual hatred. The media power can be used for this purpose. Dialogue activities can be improved. The frame of the hate crime must be clearly drawn, and sectarian discrimination must be understandably defined. Necessary units should be established for effective struggle with these crimes and their perpetrators. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So 2 main approaches, one which is identified as modernity, actually. The modern approach indeed is about mostly a common national identity and, you know, somehow making the ethnical or religious or diverse, you know, micro identities to be forgotten, you know. So this is indeed what happened in Turkey. You know, the whole story of modernization in Turkey was the pressure of religious or ethnic-based identities and, you know, bringing a whole grand, you know, national identity to the political scheme. But over the course of last decades, what happened in Turkey indeed is the somehow reawakening of the micro-identities, you know. Now, Alevis actually are behaving like Alevis, Kurds are behaving like Kurds. So I think the second approach, which is, was identified by Buyukkara as postmodern, you know, considering different diverse identities, you know, on the basis of dialogue, negotiation, debate, etc., is too much important. So we have about 25 minutes, before giving floor to the audience, I would like to, have some remarks. I think 4 points are so much important. The first one is about pluralism, religious pluralism. Actually, pluralism is found in the nature of all religions, because religious texts, religious message are somehow reproduced, This is the reason why we are talking about religious perspectives. So we cannot indeed expect from anyone, any believers, to come only to the same religious belief, So diversity is so much important, but the diversity must be fostered by diverse mechanisms, So we cannot indeed, protect the diversity without any political, cultural, sociological mechanisms, So the second point, I think, is the inter-religious, interdenominational dialogue. It is so much important, I think, So we have national organization in almost all countries, all Muslim nations. So it is important to have to bring the ground for dialogue among this kind of religious organizations. The third point, I think, is, the importance of secular state indeed. So, together, secular state, the 4 issues actually which are seen as a challenge in modern society, as the topic of this conference, one of them is secularism. Sectarianism, nationalism, colonialism, and secularism. So I think, we as Muslims should reconsider, the importance of secularism. If any state moves under the motivation of a religious identity, indeed we cannot bring them together. We cannot bring them to dialogue, We cannot bring them to talk or to negotiate or to agree on any issue. So this is what happened in Muslim societies, unfortunately. So the secularism here, I mean, is not the laicist model which has been applied in Turkey and France, which asks believer to forget about, his or her belief system, and, just come as a, to the lifestyle, what is called under the light of reason. This is not what I mean by secularism. The secular state is the state, indeed, which respects the wall of separation between religion or religious organization and the political authority. So the political authority is something sociological, and it is changeable, and the neutrality of political authority is so important for Muslims indeed, and I think it does not serve for the dialogue among Muslims only, but also for the Islam itself, Otherwise, Islam is becoming to be manipulated under the hand of political agendas, and the 4th point, I think, is democracy. I strongly believe that if we had democracy in Muslim society, we would have no such tensions that we live today. So it is a common perspective, the democratic peace theory, since Kant, his document on perpetual peace, and is the fact that, from Vienna, conventions unfolds, we have no war between 2 democratic countries over the world. All the war, over the course of 200 years indeed, has happened, they were either between 2 authoritarian states or authoritarian democratic states. Because democratic mechanisms, democracy has its own mechanisms to solve its problems through negotiation, dialogue, politics, anything like that, So I think these 4 points are so much important, democracy in particular, and I hope, one day in Muslim societies we will have all democratic regimes in Islamic countries, and I believe that we will have not so much tension. Okay, so this is my hope. So I would like to give floor to the audience. As I said, we have about 20 minutes left. We will take first some questions. Please introduce shortly yourself, and then, whom you direct your questions. Please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Mehmet. I, of course, appreciate the organization and the conference and everything, and also the ideas that were presented by the three speakers. I have some comments, kind of, especially on the first and second. I really think is that the issue of Palestine being a center point, and maybe the problem in Syria is only an offshoot of that. But we really, let's ask a couple of questions. Probably Dr. Hashemi and Dr. Mousalli can try to answer them. Can you simulate another scenario in 2011 that Iran could have taken instead of supporting the dictatorship in Syria, maybe supporting the people of Syria? What would have been the result of that kind of scenario? This is question number one. And why the Iranian authorities, dictatorship as it is, and as you mentioned, Dr. Hashemi, why did it choose to support the dictatorship instead of the people of Syria? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. I have two questions to Dr. Nader. Thank you for the lecture. Okay, I'm here. The first question is, I would like to hear your comments about sectarianism before 1979. Because before this date, there was sectarianism. I would like to hear your comment because you mentioned from this date it changed. The second question, it's regarding the conclusion section. So someone can conclude it from your lecture that sectarianism will continue in the Middle East as long as Saudi Arabia and Iran are there and they are taking the same policies. So is there any alternative ways to de-sectarianization of the region? Thank you.
Okay, any other question? For me, please.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you to the speakers. It was brilliant. I just had a question from Dr. Mousalli. You were talking about how neoliberalism supported the forces of the West in its animosity towards Islam. And you said you were also participatory in that. You briefly talked about that. And I'm wondering if you could unpack that a bit, because I wanted to hear you talk more about that.
Thank you. Can you move to that, please? Yes.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Ramadan from Indonesia. At least I have two questions that can be answered by Professor Hashemi and Professor Mousalli. The first is it the sectarianization is one of the ways to preserve Palestine, and how do we do it rightly in the power ruling level? And the second, we are in Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia, maybe also happen in Malaysia. In the grassroots level, the impact or implication of the sectarianism creates violent extremism that we feel so bad in the grassroots level? And how do we also start it rightly in the grassroots level? Thank you so much.
Thank you. And can you...
Thank you for the presentation, and I fully agree that there is a sectarianization, as has been pointed out. But it seems to me that I didn't hear anything about how to tackle that problem. Yeah, it is a problem that has been instigated from outside, but because there was some forces within that were susceptible to that penetration. So my question is, I mean, do you have any thoughts about overcoming that? Would we need, for example, like happened in the past, sort of a synthesis, a new movement that tried to overcome or transcend, that sectarianism by bringing a new interpretation that will silence this kind of attempt to perpetuate past disagreements? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, can we take the last question? Okay, please.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. I have two questions actually to Mr. Mousalli. The first one about Iran. You said all the world community are trying to face Iran and take it down, the power of Iran, because they're trying to get out of the international control. And as we know, in Iran, we see the explanation of Iran, and after the September 11, when George Bush said there is two powers facing America and the American democracy, Iraq and Iran, but in the fact we saw the smashing, the American smashing of Iraq, but nothing happened to Iran. So why they always talking about Iran and the explanation about Iran, all of that, but we don't see any action on the reality? And the other thing, do you think the Iranian nuclear program affecting on the Palestinian issue by like shutting it down, or the success of the nuclear program? The other question, as we know, all of us are sitting here, the enemies of the Ummah, and like Israel or America, all of that. So, in your opinion, what is the best way, or the best way to face that as a students or as academics? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So actually, just last two questions. You and here. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Wasim Ahad. I come from the Indian occupied part of Kashmir, and I'm a student here, PhD student. Although I come from a different area, I come from the communication science stream, but the ubiquity of the topic, Islam, politics, religion, I find it inescapable to follow this topic, to ask a question here. My question is to Dr. Nader. He talked about sectarian politics. So I was wondering if this sectarian politics today in the Middle East or anywhere in the world, it can be comparable to the colonial time divide and rule policy that we know in the Indian subcontinent. Can it be comparable to the colonial time divide and rule policy of British time, especially with reference to the division of Bengal and then the separation of Bangladesh from Pakistan? So actually there were two identities were involved, the Bengali identity and then the Islamic identity. So could it be can you please give us some idea about can it be comparable, these two identities? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And the last question from Uwais Khan, please.
Hi, my question is a little bit more theoretical, so bear with me. I saw that there was a little bit of a tension between, one, the modern Muslim political actors' desire to overcome denominational pressures by trying to create a new discourse. but at the same time growing sectarianization. So my question is there anything, I mean, we could chalk this all up to authoritarianism, but and the modern nation state, but is there anything at tension between like the Salafization of Muslim discourse and sectarianization? That is, the attempt to overcome denominational troubles through a new method of approaching a religion. Is there something there in its methods that actually leads to sectarianization rather than overcoming sectarianization? That was the grand hope.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have so many questions, but we are... okay, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice organization. And you analyzed problems which Ummah is facing. But here, I think we have a problem. We are taking Western mentality as a framework and trying to analyze Ummah problem. You know, here, I think there are, since Adam, there are two ways of evaluating. One way is the way of prophets, based on Tawheed and Adalah. The other way of pharaohs, based on oppression, exploitation, and unjustful way. Owing to this reason, we explain this point wherever we go all over the world. Islam is not a religious like other religions. Islam is a religion of Allah, the creator of universe. It is a way of peace and Islam. Owing to this reason, there are two paradigms in evaluating system. One is Tawheed and Adalah. Tawheed means God, there is one God, no others, who created human being in order to establish on this world Iman and Islam. And owing to this reason, the conditions of the Iman and Islam is to protect human rights and distribute cost and benefit in social life justly. This is Islam is based on these two paradigms. It is a way of peace. Wherever prophets and Muslim rulers go, they establish peace and reduce conflict. The other system, Pharaoh system, is based on two paradigms. They say we are powerful and we can give you as a right what we want. Because source of right is power. The second paradigm, distribution, the game of distribution will be determined by powerful side. This is also civilization of pharaohs, Greece and Roman Empire. Owing to this reason, today, all sectarianism, all other problems are created but by the civilization based on power and unjust system. Owing to this reason, we should of course explain what is going on the world. We shouldn't neglect Western analysis, but we should try to solve how we can make Iman and Islam. That's our duty.
So I am sorry. Can we come to the end?
Yeah,
please?
just
it's a very important contribution, but we have
for one sentence. We couldn't accept Islam as a religion like other religions. There are two kinds of religion. One is religion of God is called Islam. the other man-made religions to protect powerful side interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. We have just about 15 minutes left. So can I kindly ask to the distinguished professors to, limit their answers with 3 minutes if possible. So shall we start with yourself, please?
I mean, there are so many questions, but I try to answer in a general way rather in one-to-one response, except the last one. I think this is, we are here not, trying to have a propagation of your view about what Islam is and Islam is not, or your own understanding imposed on us. Even everything, every word you said is contested and what it means. We using the latest of methods and understanding we have using any possible knowledge or science. There's nothing wrong in it. Everything you are around you, your clothes, your watch, and everything you are wearing as well, it was not made by an Islamic ideology. It was made by science, production, industry, and so on. Your own division of the world into one or the other also is problematic in the sense of deciding who is who and who defines what and who gets what and who controls whom and so on. This is a big issue. This is ideology. I don't want to, be dealing with it in this place. We are not doing. We are talking about what is our problem. Our problem today, we are the underdog. We are controlled. We are trying to do something. The ideology you posted has been there since the 1920s up till today and really did not lead to the rise of an Islamic strong state or an ummah or whatever you want to lead to that point. I understand where you are coming from and your perspective. But today, the problem goes beyond all of this. I worked on the issue of liberalization and so on before the connection was made between the Islamists and being used by Westerners as a force against others. Then I disconnected all of this. I have nothing to do with it anymore. Why? Because I don't want to be an instrument of using it to divide the Muslims, to find them on the grounds of sectarianism, on the ground of Salafi, Wahhabi, Ikhwani, all of these divisions. So I disconnected from that project. I'm not part of it, but at least I can think and rethink and evaluate and re-evaluate what was going on. I reached the conclusion that, and I'm sure a lot of you will not like this, that the Islamic movement diverged from its main original discourse to becoming tools for the U.S. and its power in the area. This is why at the beginning of, I remember at the beginning, I'm just give a particular example of Syria, I remember, and I had nothing to do, I was not part of it, that once we are in government, we are going to destroy Hezbollah, we are going to destroy this, we are going to do this, we are going to go. And Hezbollah or others or Iran did not do nothing at that point. The trigger for what you said, as if the Muslim Brotherhood said nothing or did nothing or so. No, they started the animosity and they forced Hamas to go in a different way. And we know where we ended, Hamas and other Muslim Brotherhood branches in terms of their development. They have, what they have done, they have failed the project that they were trying to create. this is what I have, because most of the talks I got is ideological, so my response is at that level.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, Dr. Hashemi, please.
Oh, there, thank you. Very good questions. One question that was common in many of the questions that were directed to me is, how can we combat sectarianism? How can we start to think our way out of this particular problem? Let me just say that my presentation dealt with one form of sectarianism. Sectarianism from above. Sectarianism that is state-manipulated by ruling elites to advance their particular agenda. I don't mean to suggest that there was never tensions between Sunni and Shia prior to 1979. There always has been. It's become lethalized and politicized for reasons that I argued in my presentation. So there always have been tensions. The question is, how do you deal and manage those tensions in ways that don't become bloody and don't become lethalized? And I think the comments that were made by our distinguished chairperson about the necessity for democracy, the necessity for open societies, the necessity for having an environment where you could combat people who stand up and start to speak in a negative, dehumanizing way, is the only way you can start to think of a way out of the sectarian dilemma. So, as I argued in my presentation, that authoritarianism is the context that allows for sectarian conflict to proliferate. The way to think outside of, or the way to think toward a desectarian solution for the region is to think about the opposite of authoritarianism, and that is democratization. Democratization allows for at least the space, the opportunity to meet without coercion, to challenge narratives that are being imposed on people. And so I think that's broadly the way forward. The Indonesian student asked a good question about how can we at the grassroots level deal with the proliferation of sectarianism in our communities. I think part of the challenge with your question is you have to be able to push back against dominant interpretations of Islam that masquerade as authentic and claim to be the only acceptable interpretation. When I went to Malaysia for the first time 3 or 4 years ago, I was shocked by how much anti-Shia hysteria was going on in Malaysia in 2014, and I asked my hosts, how many Shia live in Malaysia that there's such great hysteria that they're taking over? And they said, well, there's very little. There's actually a very small, minute community, but the hysteria is there. So how do you explain it? It's been directly fueled and funded by the spread of Saudi money in alliance with the authoritarian regime at that time in Malaysia. The Saudis have invested heavily in this particular part of the world, also in Indonesia. Thankfully, there was an election in Malaysia recently, and the new government is sort of trying to roll this back. And I think that, again, points to the importance of elections, of democracy, to challenge these particular dehumanizing depictions of people and other sort of groups. I think that's incredibly important. You cannot, I think, envision challenging the problem of sectarianism unless you can think outside of the authoritarian box, which perpetuates these particular these particular problems. Let me just cite one thing that I think is incredibly important. Part of the challenge of rolling back sectarianism is to be able to name and shame those people at the grassroots level who are fueling sectarian tensions. And I want to mention one particular person who I know many people in this room respect, but who has been a big problem in recent years in perpetuating sectarian tensions in the Arab and Islamic world. And unfortunately, the person that I'm referring to is Yusuf Qaradawi. Widely respected, widely influential, but if you listen to what he has been saying, both before the Arab Spring and afterward, it has contributed to this problem. He has to be challenged on his statements. He has to be, I think, taken to task. He has to be engaged in dialogue. He's deeply influential. Unless you can do that, and unless you have the environment and opportunity to do that without being attacked, coerced, and repressed, then there's no way of solving this problem. And I'm not saying that he's the only problem. When I speak to Shia majority audiences, I will identify those Shia sectarian entrepreneurs who are playing the same role as Qaradawi is in the Arab world, and I will push back on them. I think you have to start to be able to have a public debate on these issues and try to sort of challenge people's arguments on that particular level. So I want to just end with one particular story that I think I tell my students in the United States about sectarianism, how to understand it. Yes, there always was sectarian tensions between Muslims. They're not as bad as they are today, but they've existed. And yes, colonial powers have manipulated them in different ways. But the figure of Jamaluddin al-Afghani, who's actually one of my big heroes, is interesting to think about. Most people don't know that Jamaluddin al-Afghani, the founder of modern Islamic political thought, was an Iranian. But when he goes and he starts traveling the Islamic world, he presents himself as an Afghan, as a Sunni, acknowledging that there were tensions and there were differences between Sunni and Shia. But if you read Afghani closely, and I read him every year because we talk about him in my classes, there's no reference, there's no discussion of Sunni Shia sectarianism. The themes then are fighting imperialism, pan-Islamic unity. There's no discussion of sectarianism in anything that Afghani wrote. If you look at his disciples, Muhammad Abdu, and other important thinkers who've shaped modern Islamic political thought in the 20th century, both Sunni and Shia, you don't see any discussion of sectarianism. You can go through the list. Muhammad Abdu, Muhammad Iqbal, Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb, Maulana Maududi, even in Khomeini. You begin to see it at the end of the 20th century. It happens after 1979. The one outlying figure is Rashid Rida, who does have a sectarian dimension to him in one phase of his life. But generally speaking, modern Islamic political thought does not deal with, it's not a problem, it's not an issue. But there is an acknowledgement, I think, in the figure, in the life story of al-Afghani, that there was obviously differences, and that we have to sort of be able to manage those differences. So I think in this particular story, there's a way of thinking about how to deal with the challenge of sectarianism, how to sort of push back against these narratives, and I don't think you can start to tackle this problem unless you can start to push back against the authoritarian context that fuels authoritarian discourses, that allows ruling regimes to manipulate them and to exploit existing organic tensions that have existed in Muslim societies, allow them to become lethalized and politicized by powerful political forces. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to answer all of the questions that were posed to me, but if you catch me in the coffee break, I'd be happy to engage you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Dr. Mehmet Ali, Buyukkara.
There is a question about sectarianization and relation between sectarianization and Salafication. Main character of Salafism is exclusivism, internal or external exclusivism. Its roots go back to the classical Ahl Hadith line of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. This idea describes Iman as belief in the heart, saying it in the tongue, and action. This action factor leads easily to takfir. Brother who asked the question is right. We observe the massive Salafication of Islamic movements. For instance, Taliban, I give an example from them. They are really Hanafi. What is expected normally from them is to appeal to Hanafi irja doctrine instead of takfirism, but we say the opposite one. What are the causes? The globalization, firstly. The communication opportunities are very rich and diverse now. Different sections are easily affected from each other. For example, Mujahidun, al-Muhajirun go to Afghanistan to fight together with Taliban against Soviets, and communication opportunities were very diverse, and they affect each other. Another problem is textualism. I give an example again from Taliban. Normally what is expected from them is to improve ijtihad instead of taqlid. However, education system existing has a textualist character. Imports from Indian, classical Indian textualist Hanefi, Deobandi Hanefi line. So we can see a very massification of Salafization because of these factors. There are another factors, but the most important ones are, I think, these that comes to my mind.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we have to come to the end of the session. I would like once to express my feeling of thanks and appreciation to very distinguished and respectful speakers, to Professor Dr. Ahmad Mousalli, Professor Dr. Nader Hashemi, Professor Dr. Mehmet Ali Buyukkara. And now we have a very short ceremony for certificate. And the following session will start at 11:50.
Inshallah.
Okay,
thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you for your attendance and contribution.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shah, and thanks for the speakers for a very enlightening panel. It's really exceeded all expectations. And I would like to just present the certificates and the plates to our distinguished speakers and moderator.
We prefer cash.
Unfortunately. US dollars.
Okay, please. Dr. Nader Hashemi.
Dr. Nader Hashemi, thank you. And Dr. Buyukkara. Together? Our next session is 11:50. Please be here on time. It will be on the challenge of secularism. We'll also have very distinguished panels. So this is time for a break, coffee and tea and refreshments. We'll see you back in 20 minutes, 23 minutes.
No, I really enjoyed your comments. Your comments at the end were